sadness is the ultimate bridge to connection. So to live in a cultural environment where you're not allowed to fully express the sorrow of being alive and the joy of it too. I think they are twins, joy and sorrow. Um, but to live in an environment where you're only allowed to express one half of that twinning equation is basically it's cutting off one of the strongest bridges that we actually have to each other.
Hello, and welcome to the Meta Hour podcast with Sharon Salzberg. I'm Lily Cushman. I produce this podcast. And today we're coming to you with episode 246 and a brand new guest on the pod, the wonderful Susan Cain. Susan is the author of the #1 New York Times bestsellers Quiet and Bittersweet, which was also a selection for the Oprah Book Club. Susan has spent the last few decades exploring a particular realm of human nature: quiet, sensitive, thoughtful, the bittersweet. And she's got a couple of phenomenal TED Talks if you'd like to check her out. We're so happy to finally get her on the podcast. We've been finagling schedules for a few years between Sharon and Susan, and finally it came together. And you're in store for a gorgeous conversation. Susan shares about how she came to writing, how she came to it in her life work, her kind of previous incarnation as a lawyer, and how she uses writing as a place to explore big questions that she has in her life about herself and about the way things are and cultural conditioning. And there's a lot of conversation about her most recent book, Bittersweet, and some of the different themes from that book, looking at the way that suffering brings us together and how she explores compassion in the book, and the way that longing and sadness can be a bridge to connection. Sharon was recently a guest on Susan's Quiet Life community, and they talk a fair amount about that community in this conversation as well. And some other areas of conversation are the Dalai Lama as a Darwinist, moral elevation, the person that Susan considers her patron saint, Leonard Cohen, and the history of the word loser. Also, what it is to see beauty in the broken world. And then a whole piece about how Susan learned loving kindness meditation from Sharon and reflections on that practice, and ending with chocolate and Brussels sprouts. So you're in store for a great episode. I have 0 announcements for you today. Exciting, I know. So we'll get right into the conversation. Susan Cain and Sharon Salzberg.
Hello, Susan, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Sharon. It is so good to be here with you.
It's so good to have you.
And we've been trying to do this for so long. I'm so happy it's finally happening.
It's great. So I really enjoyed our recent talk in your Quiet Life community. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of that world. And you very recently have said that you've been enjoying slowing down of late and being less in the public eye after what I would imagine would be quite a whirlwind, releasing your most recent book, Bittersweet, in 2022. And I know that there's such a unique arc in the life of a writer, which may involve a tremendous amount of solitude in the writing of the book. And then all of a sudden, a lot of being with people in the world once the book comes out. And Bittersweet was a book you worked on for many, many years. So, how is it coming back to yourself in a way after that whole cycle?
Oh, gosh. It feels really good coming back to myself because, it's a funny thing. maybe any author would say this, and certainly an introverted author would say this. I think that the act of finishing your book and then stepping out and blinking into the spotlights when you have to go and talk about it, it's just such a different process from the actual writing. And yet the writing is what attracted us in the first place, right?
Mm.
And I always feel like when I'm sitting down and writing or even researching the ideas that are going to go into a book, it feels like the most deep and intimate connection with the reader, even though I'm like sitting there by myself typing into a laptop, usually at a cafe. So I guess not technically by myself, but in my own head. But yet it's a very deep connection. And the act of talking about a book in more sort of explicitly performative spaces, like whether it's
Mhm.
an auditorium or a podcast or whatever it is, it's a very different mindset. Um, and so, yeah, I guess as much as I have come to also love that side of things, uh, the connection between reader and writer is to me probably the most sacred, and it's been that way all my life. When I was a kid, uh, loving books, it was as a reader, and I always felt the connection with the authors who moved me was so profound that that's what made me want to write books in the first place.
That's beautiful. Well, I recently had this kind of funny experience because my first book was Loving Kindness. It came out in 1995, and Shambhala Publications, which published it, realized there had never actually been an official audio version of it. So they asked me to read it for the audio version, and so for me, it was like meeting the Sharon Salzberg of 1993, 1994 when I was writing that book, and so it
Oh,
was also
wow.
seeing myself through the course of time, and it wasn't that I disagreed with what I'd said or felt it was untrue in any way, far from it, but there's a level of nuance I feel I have now that I did not have then, and I kept thinking, "Ooh, did I say it that way?" Like, wow, so it's sort of an amazing process. Once it's a book is there, it's there.
That is so true, and I don't know if you have this experience, but, like, when I'm writing a book, I will go back and reread every paragraph and every chapter 1,000 times, trying
Yeah,
to get it
yeah,
as right as I feel it possibly can be, but then once it's finished and it's out in the world, I really just never read it at all.
yeah,
The other day, I had reason to go back and look for something in Quiet, my first book, and I just kept feeling this impulse of, like, that I should be editing it, like, what is that stray phrase doing there? And
right. Yeah, of
what
course.
is that formulation? It's all wrong. So maybe that's why we don't go back.
Right. Better not to. So, since this is the first time you're on this podcast, I wondered if you could say something about your life path. When I think of you, it strikes me that you're really someone that endows such humanity in your work as a writer. And I know that from some of our previous conversations that writing is a kind of spiritual practice for you. And as you just said, it's a sacred bond with the reader. And you cite curiosity as a big driver in your life. And I'm wondering if you can share some of your story about how you arrived where you are today as a curious seeker.
Yeah, very much so. And it's interesting asking that question through the prism of writing because I was just talking, well, say I've been having an ongoing series of talks with my very beloved literary agent who I've been with from the beginning, Richard Pine. And we were kind of talking through what I might want to do for my next book. And he said, whatever, he said, you were so called to write Quiet and to write Bittersweet. We have to wait till you land on the subject to which you're called.
Hmm.
And I really do feel that way. I spend like 6 or 7 years on each book, and I do that because I'm usually trying to answer some extremely deep question.
Hmm.
And then there's also, that thing about the sacred bond between writer and reader. It's also this feeling of like wanting to connect with the other humans in the world who have perceived the things that I've perceived and maybe want to go on the same quest that I have. So I always feel like it's this process of of scribbling a message into a bottle and casting it into the sea and
Mhm.
looking for the readers who are out there on their islands who will find it and be like, yes, this is the message that I personally was looking for. So that's really what it feels like for me, which maybe is my excuse for why I don't crank out books more quickly.
Well, it's a whole kind of exploration. Like, I remember when I was writing another book, Faith, and I was really stuck so many times, and it was quite a struggle for any number of reasons at different points. And at one point, I was talking to Susan Griffin, who is a writer, an amazing writer, and explaining my woes to her, and she said, a lot of people would think you write a book on a topic like that because you know everything about it and you want to impart your expertise, but more likely you're really learning deeply about the topic, and that writing is part of the learning. And so it takes what it takes.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Absolutely. To me, that is the most fun and delicious part of the whole research process is just all the learning that goes into that.
Yeah.
And you know how have you ever taken the VIA character strength test? Do you know
No.
what I'm talking about? Oh. Oh, I have to send it to you,
Yeah.
when we're done. Yeah, so it's a really good test. It's used by a lot of organizations, and basically, it comes from the world of positive psychology, and
Mhm.
they took the kind of top 24 character strengths that humans have. But you take this test to figure out what your own top strengths are
Ooh.
and what's lower on your list of priorities also. Um, excuse me. And so for me, among my top strengths are love of learning
Mhm.
and appreciation. My number one is appreciation of beauty and excellence. And that really is like if I hear beautiful music or see a beautiful painting or something, it's the most elevating and transporting experience I can imagine, and then it's followed always by this immediate impulse to wanna share it with everybody else who might have the same reaction, and then as a writer, it kind of motivates me to want to craft a jewel. That's always what my goal is, and I've come to accept that I'm never gonna craft the perfect jewel that's in my mind, but
Mhm.
the act of trying to do it is, to me, so satisfying and so thrilling. Yeah, that's what it's like, and I have to send you this test and
Oh, yes.
so you can tell me what your top strengths are.
I'll have it done by tonight. Later tonight. I can't wait. But you're also reminding me of a time I was in Atlanta, actually, and the Dalai Lama was speaking at the university there, and he was on a panel with Alice Walker and Richard Gere, and the panel was being put on, sponsored by the art department, so it was about art and artistic endeavor. And the first question was one I have heard many, many times in different contexts, which was basically, do you really need to be suffering deeply in order to create well? Does great art have to come out of great pain? And it was very interesting because first Alice Walker spoke and she said, when I was young and a poet and I was in a lot of pain, and that's how I was taught. That was the ethos in which I was taught to be a poet. She said, that's what I believe. She said, but as I've gotten older and happier, I think my work's getting better. And then Richard Gere talked about being a tortured young artist, and the Dalai Lama looked puzzled the whole while, as he often does in some kind of cultural exchange. And he said, in Tibet or in the West in general, people are always taking me places like to a museum and pointing to sculpture or paintings and saying, aren't they beautiful? Or look at that building, look at the architecture, isn't it beautiful? And he said, in Tibet, we believe the worth or the beauty of a work of art depends upon the transformation of the artist in the act of creating it. So we would say something was beautiful if the artist became more enlightened, wiser, kinder in the process of the creation. And I thought, what a different standard.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah. You just reminded me of that, and what you said.
You know what you're making me think of? There's a quotation that I shared in Bittersweet because I love it so much. I don't know if I'm gonna find the exact words, but it comes from the painter Mark Rothko, and he said, the people who weep before my paintings are having the same religious experience that I had when I was making them.
Yeah.
And I always love that. I love it for so many reasons. Number one, because there is something about those religious tears that I think are called up by great art. And I also love it because I think that we have the idea that that art is most and beauty is most owned by painters and those who compose symphonies and act in great films and that kind of thing. And in fact, I think there is zero distinction between the people who do that and the people who consume and love art and feel transformed by it. I think it's one and the same process.
hmm
And I wish we didn't have this false distinction.
Well, one aspect of the journey of, becoming more whole, it's so striking is the universality in the human experience. And that is the power of art or writing or music to articulate those kinds of moments, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what made me decide to write Bittersweet in the first place, I think we've talked about this. Um, it actually started for me because all through my life, I kept having this experience of listening. Well, I love all kinds of music, but in particular, listening to kind of sad and longing music
hmm
and feeling anything but sad. Feeling really quite the contrary, feeling like a sense of connection with the musician and what I can only describe as a tidal wave of love coming from the feeling that the musician is able to express and to transform into something beautiful the sorrow that all human beings must experience at one time or another.
hmm
A- And I could not I mean, even what I just said, I didn't really understand when I was first writing the book. I just couldn't figure out why it was that I found sad music so elevating. And that's what set me off into this whole quest to just understand the bittersweet nature of experience and why we're so cut off from it in a culture that tells us to wear a smiling face at all times.
hmm
But also just like what are the deeper truths that are embedded in that kind of music and in those kinds of experiences.
Well, it's the joining, right? That sense of connection, which is um, so extraordinary. It's why I think, when researchers are checking out the brains of people doing compassion meditation and they see the pleasure center lighting up, and at first it was considered really bizarre, like, because you're opening to suffering, someone else's pain, and you're considering the pain in the world. Like, why is the pleasure center lighting up? That's too weird. But it's not that you're enjoying the fact that they're suffering, but it's the joining, it's the sense of connection that brings us together. It's finding ourselves in one another. And it's like, with some of the teachings, like one of the most beautiful moments I would have when I would hear a passage from the Buddha or something like that was, "Oh, I kind of always knew that, but I never had the
Yes.
words," something like that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that what you just said is it completely. It's this fundamental sense of connection.
It's beautiful. So you are someone that's been described as giving voice to introverts, which is in reference to your book Quiet. And so I think in the past few decades, there's been a growing movement of inclusion for people who maybe don't resemble the normative vision of success in the West. And your work has been a part of that change of inclusion, and it takes a lot of inner strength and resolve to feel we're a part of things, to feel empowered in the ways that we're maybe different from what is really a kind of mythic structure. It makes no sense, that image that's held up to us, and we can so easily surrender to that image and feel just off. We're bad, we're wrong, we're different. But we're also different, and that image anyway is such a bizarre construct. So I'm wondering what that process has been like for you of finding a kind of personal agency and then inviting others to also embrace it.
I hadn't exactly made this connection until listening to your question just this very
Mhm.
second, but you've talked about how in your life journey
Mhm.
you felt lesser than and different,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
it was only when you discovered that there was kind of a purpose to
Hmm.
your suffering and that you weren't alone and all of those things, that
Yeah.
I think you started to find your strength. And I think I probably went through a parallel process when it comes to my embrace of the quiet, sensitive, introverted, bittersweet part of the human experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that, I keep alluding to it. Like I grew up as a deep reader. And I think many of the people who write books for children have that particular temperament and personality profile of the quiet, the sensitive, the bittersweet. And so they write a lot of protagonists who are like that. And those protagonists in these books are having great adventures that are informed by their extreme sensitivity. And like none of this is ever spelled out, but
Hmm.
it just is there in all the books. You look at Madeleine L'Engle's books, for example, A Wrinkle in
Hmm.
Time and a bunch of other ones that she wrote. And they're full of these kinds of characters. And so I grew up reading those books. So even though there was, of course, the part of me that felt at odds with the culture that tells us to be bold and extroverted and thick-skinned and all the rest, there was that part of me that was very much at odds with that, and that's why I felt the need to write these books. There was also coexisting with that the whole time, um, a kind of deeper inner sense of what the worth and the value is of that way of being. And I think that also sustained me and gave me power through the whole process. And it probably also helped to grow up in a family of introverts where I don't know whether I said it to myself in so many words, but I would just kind of look around and, I saw how like my grandfather was a great rabbi and also a very quiet and shy person. And my father was a great doctor who could diagnose people who couldn't otherwise figure out their diagnoses. And I would observe how he would come home every day after work and spend hours like poring over medical journals and studying and, like deep into a productive solitude. And so I was also kind of just living with people around me where I could see how their way of being in the world made a lot of sense. And all of that helped a lot.
And you've really built an incredible quiet life community through your Substack, which is a really rich offering with live events and different practices and extensive writing. And I'm wondering if that was sort of an extension of this, sense of your own empowerment journey to build your own table in a way and invite others to join you.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Like that, it has been such a nourishing thing, because, for all these years, I've gotten the most amazing, amazing letters from my readers and comments on social media posts, but there wasn't a way to interact in a different kind of way. And now we do things like what we did with you, where you
Hmm.
came on for a candlelight chat and we got to talk and you got to talk with members of the community. And it always becomes, and we do it on Zoom, and it always becomes this kind of magical chemistry. I think because it's a collection of people who are interested in living on this particular wavelength. It's not a better or worse wavelength. It just is its own particular wavelength, um, that isn't easily found. And here's a group of people who are finding it together. And that's incredibly uplifting. Um, and I think I also had the vision of creating this because of my grandfather, who I mentioned. So he served the same congregation for 63 years, really until 2 weeks before he passed away at the age of 94. He was still giving sermons and with his congregation. And at the time that he passed away, I was still a lawyer, which was the thing I did when I was in my 20s because I thought I should be practical and learn to support myself. Um, and I didn't hate it, but I lived for vacations. I didn't love it. And I remember when my grandfather passed away and I was reflecting on how he, as I said, he was out there, quote, working until 2 weeks before his death. And I remember sitting in my office in New York City, looking out the window and thinking, gosh, I would not want to be doing this when I'm 94 years old. And I don't even totally want to be doing it right now. And that was a real turnaround point for me. And it took a few years to really turn that ship around and go in another direction. But it really was one of those epiphany moments. And his example of having a kind of, I don't know, congregation, it sounds almost too lofty, but like a group of people who can try to lift each other up and who are oriented around a particular frequency. I think there's something incredibly meaningful to that. And it doesn't really matter almost if there's 10 people in that group or 100,000 people in that group or somewhere in between. It's the fact of the shared frequency that I find really delicious.
Yeah, wonderful. So, back to your latest book, Bittersweet, and we won't always be able to say your latest book because
But knowing me, you'll be able to say it for a while.
right. It's like a Broadway musical. They say it takes 7 years, and I go, "Okay," So in Bittersweet, you're inviting us to reexamine a good bit of our cultural conditioning, around our relationship to sadness and melancholy, and you make such a wise observation in the book, amongst many wise observations, that our cultural conditioning has cut us off from empathy. That inability to recognize our own pain, our own sadness, has cut us off from being able to resonate when we witness that in others. And so it reminds me too of, one of the big misunderstandings about meditation is that when we get really good at meditating, we won't feel anything anymore. We'll just be kind of this blob of, equipoise or something, but without any intensity, without any kind of feeling. And so, can you share your thoughts on why it's so important to be able to be with sadness and how that relates to our humanity?
Well, I guess there's so much I would say, but I'll say two things, three things. One is what we were talking about before, that sadness is the ultimate bridge to connection. So to live in a cultural environment where you're not allowed to fully express the sorrow of being alive and the joy of it too. I think they are twins, joy and sorrow. But to live in an environment where you're only allowed to express one half of that twinning equation, um, is basically it's cutting off one of the strongest bridges that we actually have to each other. And oh my gosh, there's this really interesting thing that I explored in the book about the Dalai Lama, which is that it was actually Darwin at first who figured out or noted in his book, The Descent of Man, that in all mammals, he said the strongest impulse is the social impulse by which the compassionate instinct for one animal to respond to and try to help another animal in need, which I know sounds like impossibly Pollyanna-ish. And of course, Darwin also noticed and was horrified by the cruelty that also exists in animals. But he did notice this phenomenon of the impulse of one crow to help another crow, or a baboon to help a zookeeper who was being attacked by another baboon, like all these different instances that he noted. And then 100 years after that, along comes the psychologist Dacher Keltner, who starts researching this compassionate instinct, and he finds it to be kind of rooted in in the way our bodies have evolved. Because basically what happens is infants are born human infants are born completely defenseless. And we as the adults in those infants' lives are primed to listen to sounds of distress in order to take care of our infants, and that's how the species survives. But we don't only have the capacity to do that for our own infants. From there radiates out this wider compassionate instinct. So the amazing thing about the Dalai Lama is that he and Dr. Keltner had a conversation about this, and the Dalai Lama said, "Oh, this is something I've been noticing
Mm.
all my life too, and from now on, I'm gonna call myself a Darwinist." And I thought that was so interesting.
And it is interesting because when I was writing something about awe and doing just beginning to do research, it was before Ducker's book came out on awe, and I had the mistaken impression that because that was the only research I had seen that, people we tended to feel awe when we went off to the redwood forest and we saw the majestic trees and, out of nature, but it turned out that the most significant place people feel awe is witnessing the goodness of other people.
Right, right.
Like watching the service and the care and the generosity, and I know that's true for me. It's like I am awestruck when I see goodness in people, very, not famous people necessarily at all, or celebrated people, very hardworking people sometimes who are not celebrated, really the opposite. And it's so beautiful.
Yeah, there's that feeling that psychologists call moral elevation, and I love that description of it. Like I think of a video that circulated a while ago, in an earthquake, and you saw a man rescuing a baby from the rubble of the earthquake, and you just experience this surge of love and joy and awe and elevation and all the rest of it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Now I want to write something on moral elevation. Okay.
I think John Haidt has a paper about it, but if you
Uh-huh.
can't find it easily, let me know because I have it somewhere in my files.
Thank you. You're my new research library. Thank you.
Anytime.
It's so great. So here's a quotation from you. If we realize that all humans know or will know loss and suffering, we can turn toward each other, which I think is one of the most beautiful understandings ever. And it also reminds me of a story I've told many times about when I was leaving India in 1974. And I was a student of meditation, and for a number of reasons, I had to come back to the States in 74 for what I was confident was going to be a very, very short visit where I got like a new visa and saw my family and did these things. And then I was going to turn around and go back to India for the entire rest of my life. And uh, I went to see one of my teachers, this woman named Deepa Ma, which is like a nickname, Deepa's mother, Deepa Ma, who was living in Calcutta, so, to get her blessing for my very, very short journey back to the States. And I told her I was going back to the US, and she said, "Well, when you go back, you'll be teaching." And I said, "No, I won't." And she said, "Yes, you will." I said, "No, I won't." I mean, it was ridiculous that I could teach meditation. And she said, "Yes, you will." And I said, "No, I won't." And then she said two things that were really amazing. She said, "You really understand suffering. That's why you should teach." And it was only sort of then that I looked back at the sorrow of my early life and thought, oh, that could be purposeful and something important, that could help me turn toward other people. And then she said to me, "You can do anything you want to do. It's your thinking you can't do it that's going to stop you." And I left her little room, up 4 flights of stairs and walked down those stairs thinking, "No, I won't. That's ridiculous." And of course, I came back to the States, and as life evolved, I woke up one morning months later and I thought, "Ooh, she was right," But it was also interesting. She didn't say to me at that time, "Your level of scholarship is so mind blowing, you should teach," or "Your level of, enlightened realization is so extraordinary, you should teach." She said, "You really understand suffering. That's why you should teach."
I just had goosebumps. I love that story so
Yeah.
much, and I love what the last bit that you just said reveals about our culture and really all of us, and how it's very hard to let go of the idea that our worth resides not just in our achievements, but in our ability to project a kind of can do, got this
Uh-huh.
attitude towards everything. Um, and as you say, she was not finding your worth in your
Mhm.
scholarship or awards or whatever it happened to
Yeah.
be, but rather just in your humanity. Um, and I had an experience like this literally just last night. So, you know that I dedicated Bittersweet to the musician Leonard Cohen, who,
Mm.
he is my personal rabbi and patron saint and guide and all the rest. I absolutely adore his work, his poetry, his being. Um, and and last night I was having a difficult night because I mentioned to you before we started, I had a medical procedure this morning that turned
Mhm.
out totally fine, but it was kind of difficult last night.
Mhm.
And and I happened at the time to come across a video of Leonard Cohen's that I hadn't seen before from when he was quite young, and he was introducing a new song. And I wish I could remember his exact words, but he very unabashedly said something like, "This is a song about the experience of a human coming into the mystifying catastrophe that is this
Mhm.
world," or something like that, that just like fully and unabashedly acknowledged the difficulty that comes with being alive and marrying it to the transcendence of being alive.
Mhm.
And I've always, and I feel like the reason I've always loved him so much is that, well, I mean, many reasons, like he's just an incredible poet and so on, but he's so frank and unflinching and unembarrassed about naming what what it is to live in this world of joy and sorrow. And I feel like that's what Deepa Ma was saying to you.
Mhm.
Like, she was saying to you that you've lived it and you're unabashed, or you can be unabashed, and you
Mhm.
can teach other people to find their transcendence through living this truth and just looking at it in a clear-eyed way instead of, uh, feeling that you're better or worse for the
Mhm.
amount you have or haven't suffered. Like, that whole line of inquiry is just like a blind alley.
Mhm.
And it's the people who can show us that that's a blind alley and turn us in a different direction who are the best guides.
Yes, absolutely. I was just listening to Leonard Cohen's song Hallelujah the other day, which feels like the perfect song to me. And I realized I don't have a clue what this is about. Like, what do these lyrics mean? I don't know. I've never known, and I probably never will know, but nonetheless, doesn't matter.
Yeah, because I mean, because you do know without knowing what
That's
they're
right.
about technically, you know they're about the beautiful brokenness of the world or the
Yeah.
broken
Yeah.
beauty of the world. Like, that's that's what they are.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah.
So you're also reminding me of something I quoted of Bob Thurman's, where he told me, Bob lost an eye when he was a very young man, like in his maybe 21 or something like that. He was underneath a car doing a repair and it fell. I mean, it was a terrible story, and he lost an eye. Then he ended up going to India, and he had a teacher actually in New Jersey, a Mongolian monk, who was a very very important Dharma teacher for him. And this monk said to him, "You should never be ashamed of your suffering. Like, you should never be ashamed that you lost an eye." He said, "You've lost an eye physically, but you've gained like 1,000 eyes of wisdom."
Whoa.
And yeah, it was amazing. And so I recounted that story somewhere. And friends, like, that's the one line that they keep quoting back to me. You should never be ashamed of your suffering.
Yeah, and it's funny that we are. It's
Yeah.
funny that we are, but I mean, there's such an interesting cultural history to why we are. That's one of the things that I looked at in Bittersweet because I was trying to figure out, like, where did this whole idea come from? Um, and a lot of it is that, like especially in the 19th century, as we became a a society that like it was transforming from agriculture to business, it became increasingly important to be a success at business. And then and then all through the 19th century, there were all these panics and busts where people would lose everything. And this question started to arise of like, okay, for the guy who lost all his money, was this just bad luck? Or was it something, quote, in the man, like something inside the man that made him prone to this loss? And from there, you quickly develop the idea of a quote loser, the loser, and the use of the word loser has just increased and increased and increased with time. And I think that's where it all comes from. Like if the worst, if what we want to do is show ourselves to be winners and not and show ourselves not as people who have some inner quality that marks us out as losers, then the last thing you want to do is talk about your suffering or your awareness of sorrow or your sad feelings or your fear or whatever it is,
Mhm.
because it really is the ultimate admission that you're marked for failure. And I think that's the dynamic that we have to liberate ourselves from.
Absolutely. And that is a real kind of freedom. So you make the connection in your book between connection and compassion, and obviously the opening to suffering and sorrow. So that brings me to loving kindness practice, which actually brought us together in the
Yes.
first place. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about loving kindness and the part it plays in your understanding.
Yeah. Well, you were so nice to me when I was going through the process of writing this book. I really wanted to understand loving kindness meditation, and I wanted to understand it for a couple of reasons. One was everything that we've just been talking about, this intuition that I felt that at the heart of this deep reaction that I had to sad music was love. And that our sorrows and our joys bring us together, and it's a form of love. But what I was also trying to understand and what I wrote about is this difficult relationship that I had had for most of my life with my mother. And I won't tell that whole story here, but I will say that it kind of left me with the question of how and is it possible to love someone so intensely, even when you know the relationship hurts you, and how do you balance those two things? And you were and then how to employ the practice of loving kindness meditation to achieve that balance. And you were so incredibly wise and patient with me, and I remember you kept telling me stories of, like you told a story of a woman who, I guess in her case, she had a relationship with her mother, and it sounds like the mother was maybe physically abusive and dangerous to her.
Mhm.
And then there was tell me if I'm getting the story wrong, but there was a time when the mother felt she needed her daughter and wanted to see her in person, and the daughter felt, "Well, I don't wanna go, but here I am, like, devoting all this time." The person was working at the time with the Dalai Lama, and here I am
Mhm. Mhm.
devoting all this time to the Dalai Lama and to others, and I'm not giving anything to my mother. And what can you remind me, what did the Dalai Lama say to her at that moment?
Yeah, she went to him in that kind of guilt and being torn because she had been doing this work with him, uh, and of course, he is, for many people, including my friend, like the exemplar of, loving kindness and compassion. And he listened to what she had to say, and he said, you should send your mother an enormous amount of loving kindness from a distance. He said, it's not safe. And that was an extraordinary moment, not only for her, of course, but for me, in hearing it, because one of the great confusions about loving kindness is that it's going to make us sort of simpering and weak, and we'll give in to everybody, and we'll do things forgetting about ourselves and just sort of abandon ourselves in a misaligned way, in a wrong way. And it's really not that at all. It's not martyrdom, and it's not giving up discernment and intelligence and real awakening. And so there's times like that, we have tough love, we have the need for boundaries, we have a need for limits, we have a need for space, and we need to care about ourselves as well as others.
And I remember when you told me this story, I wasn't questioning the need for the daughter to protect herself from her mother.
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
made total sense. But my question was, what good does it do her mother for her daughter to be sitting silently wishing her mother well and wishing her mother love from a distance? Because her mother has no
Mhm.
idea that this is happening. Um, and I remember the first thing that you said to that was, well, it does the daughter good, and that's not nothing.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
was very struck by that. But I'm gonna ask you to answer the question right here, if you would.
Sure. I was gonna say, "What did I say?"
I think I can tell you, but I don't know. I thought it'd be good to hear in your words.
That's always interesting, like, I mean, it does do the daughter good, and then, there are other actions that might ensue, not from bitterness and not from resentment and not from vengefulness, or fear, but there's a kind of generosity of the spirit that can be generated. It may not be in that form, of visiting, but it may someday or may not, it's not about a particular kind of action in a way. It's about the transformation of one's being so that whatever we do doesn't have to come from a place of fear
Yeah, yeah,
and a sense of separation. And sometimes, there's a lot of tenderness that comes because life is change, and it doesn't mean someone is going to change and we're living in that kind of, false hope, false certainty that it's going to work out exactly the way I want it to. It's not that at all, but it's allowing someone the living possibility of actually changing, and sometimes they do, or you see, some people die very much along the lines of how they lived, and some people actually have have something happen so that there's a genuine sense of connection that could never be achieved earlier.
yeah. You did say something like that at the time, and it was fantastic. Um, and what I was thinking about as I was listening to you describe this phenomenon this time is how you don't hear, or maybe you do hear this a lot. I don't know. I don't hear a lot people talk about love and kindness and boundaries
Mhm.
in the same sentence, but
Yeah.
really, I think loving kindness meditation is literally the best thing anybody could ever do to enhance their sense of boundaries in a healthy way. Because you know how
Mhm.
when you have really good boundaries and it's no longer fraught for you, you can kind of cheerfully set the boundaries in a way that's not pushing the other person away because you no longer feel so entrenched. You're just
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
calm about it. And I think that the loving kindness practice, the element of it in which you are wishing love to the people in your life who you find difficult
Mhm.
is so incredibly powerful in that way in terms of helping us to get to that place of non-fraught boundary setting.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because we're such a, myriad of elements, and conditioning and our own personal sorrows and fears and misguided understanding about where happiness is actually to be found. And, so if you grew up with a kind of conditioning, or you've gotten a kind of conditioning of, you will be happiest by squelching other people and competing endlessly and coming out on top. And, it's no wonder that if we believe that we end up feeling very lonely and apart from everybody. And you have to disentangle that in order to see through it. And not everyone does that. And so there is a kind of compassion we can have.
Absolutely. Plus, we can also share chocolate. I'm just remembering that when you were teaching me loving kindness meditation, we were having those Who chocolate bars.
Yeah, you brought me chocolate. That was wonderful. Thank you.
It was just so good. I don't know. I just felt like it was, to me anyway, really sublime moment in time to sit there with you randomly on a Tuesday afternoon, eating chocolate and learning meditation. And I thank you so much.
Oh, well, if my memory is correct, you came with chocolate and Brussels sprouts, and so we put the Brussels sprouts in the refrigerator and
That's
ate
so
the
funny. I
chocolate.
edited out the Brussels sprouts
Yeah,
from my
you did.
memory. I remember only the chocolate.
Yeah. No, it was well, there's a reason for that. Not I actually like Brussels sprouts, so thank
Me
you for that
too.
as
Me
well,
too.
so but the moment really called for chocolate. So, you mentioned recently you have a new book in the works. I don't know if you wanna say anything about that at all.
Oh gosh, I think I'm not really ready to say anything because you know how I talked at the beginning about how I'm not ready to truly write a book until I figure out what I'm so deeply called by that I want to sit and investigate it for 7 years.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of in that process now. And I will say that it has to do with spirituality and with spiritual principles from
Uh-huh.
various traditions, but I'm still turning it over in my mind.
Well, it'll be wonderful, and so come over anytime. I'll give you chocolate this time
Thank you.
and, share whatever you'd like to share. So, before we finish, I'm hoping you'll lead us in some kind of practice or reflection of some kind.
Yes. Well, so we were talking about the candlelight chats that we do at the Quiet Life, where you were so generous to be one of our guests, and everybody loved it so, so, so much. Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
And we just had another candlelight chat recently with the great author Pico Iyer. And and we did a kind of prompt at the end of the chat that gave rise to so much amazing depth and a kind of relief, I would say, a relief of love and connection that I want to share it. And what I would say to anybody who's listening now is that if you feel like it, to try to have a pen and paper or an iPad or laptop or whatever you use for writing down some words, because I'm going to ask you to write down some words. So first, I'm going to give you this quote that comes from Pico, where he said, "Writing is, in the end, that oddest of anomalies, an intimate letter to a stranger." And so now my question to you all, dear listeners, is what intimate letter would you want to write to a kind and receptive stranger? Like, really imagine this incredibly kind and receptive person. And what would you want to share about your own experience? And what would you want to ask about theirs? And so I'll let you take a moment to reflect on what you've come up with. And I can tell you, when we did this in our community, what I was so struck by is how, by giving people the freedom to imagine that the person that they were writing to is extremely kind and receptive, that brought up so much love in people. And so many people had written such loving notes. And it made me think that probably the greatest obstacle that we have to living in love is not being sure that the person on the other side is going to be as kind and receptive as we wished. But if we knew that, if we knew with confidence that they would be, we would be our most loving selves. And so, what would it do for us to see in everyone, or let's say in most of the people who we interact with, the parts of them that are their most kind and most receptive? And so, as I want to do, we talked a lot about Leonard Cohen in this session, and I thought I would leave you all with one of my favorite quotes of his, which goes, I greet you from the other side of sorrow and despair with a love so vast and shattered it will reach you everywhere.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you. And thank you for coming. Thank you for the conversation. I appreciate you so much. And it's wonderful to be able to share you with the listeners. And we'll keep these conversations going in some form or another. So take good care.
I would absolutely love that. And thank you so much for everything you've given to me personally and to the world. I really, really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey folks, thanks so much for listening. If you would like to learn more about Susan's Quiet Life community, you can head over to thequietlife.net. That is TheQuietlife.net. And get yourself a copy of Bittersweet, which is available in all the places. And if you'd like to just learn more about Susan Cain, her website is susancain.net. SUSANCAIN.net. For all things Sharon, including her online courses, guided meditations, as well as the archive of all these podcasts, you can head over to SharonSalzberg.com. And thanks for being here. This has been the Metta Hour podcast, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live with ease.